through the book, you have some poems that are really sweet and full of love, and then the very next page will be about something heavy like street violence or pain. So, is it hard for you to switch gears like that as a writer, or is that just what real life feels like to you?
So I think real life is a mix of pleasure and pain. It's like duality, like the yin and yang symbol. There's the good within the bad. Of course, poems like Sweet that deal with romance, Loving You Past the Midnight Hour, which again deals with romance, or unconditional love, as well as the fact that there is the violent side. But it's the love that kind of like makes you want to fight the violence, kind of fight for justice. And so it's kind of like you gotta be able to have like the talk about the pleasure and the pain with the pleasure. You don't know who you're reaching out to. You don't know who you're going to be affecting. And then there's the other person be like, I love the love poems because like this is when I want to feel most vulnerable.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Pages of Pandora. I'm incredibly excited about our conversation today because our guest wears so many vital hats in our community. He's an activist organizer, a lay minister, a journalist whose work has appeared in the Black Agenda report. But today we are diving into a different, deeply personal side of the expression. He's also a poet and author, and we are looking at his powerful collection, Written in Blood anthology. This book bridges everything from raw coming of age reflection and romance to sharp, unapologetic socio political commentary. Robert, it is an absolute honor to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very looking forward to it.
Yes. The very first question is the title of your book is Written in Blood. That is pretty intense name. So where did that title come from and why did it feel like the right fit for your poems?
Wow, that's a really good question. So the reason why I chose the title Written in Blood is because I was looking at the history of the United States, right? And when you look at the history of the United States, it's really, when you break down to it, there's a lot of bloodshed. When you really look at the history, like when you look at uh, the genocide of the indigenous peoples, the First Nations, you look at the forced enslavement of Africans and their descendants, as well as when you look at the exclusion of immigrants from the Chinese Exclusion Act to even to how like some of your first Indian Afghan immigrants were treated, like the Sikhs, when they were treated, they were trying to look for work. And I felt like the right fit for my poems because given what was going on, like during that time period when I was coming of age, you had the Arab Spring, you had the rise of Black Lives Matter, as well as locally, I kind of felt like, something, I think this, like given the history, what I know about this country and given everything that's going on, I think the title Written in Blood is very appropriate. So that's why I went with it.
Right, that makes sense. So, reading through the book, you have some poems that are really sweet and full of love, and then the very next page will be about something heavy like street violence or pain. So, is it hard for you to switch gears like that as a writer, or is that just what real life feels like to you?
So I think real life is a mix of pleasure and pain. It's like duality, like the yin and yang symbol. There's the good within the bad and the bad within the good. So you got to have love, right? And there's like several types of love that I do talk about in Written in Blood. You have like, of course, poems like Sweet that deal with romance, Loving You Past the Midnight Hour, which again deals with romance. But there's also like agapic or unconditional love, like the love that you have for your fellow man, your fellow woman in community, as well as the fact that there is the violent side. But it's the love that kind of like makes you want to fight the violence. It's love that kind of makes you want to, kind of fight for justice. And so it's kind of like you gotta be able to have like the talk about the pleasure and the pain with the pleasure, and you need to be able to like talk about these things so that way you don't know who you're reaching out to. You don't know who you're going to be affecting. Someone could be like, hey, you know what? I'm reading this poem. I'm reading this piece, and it's spitting exactly how I feel. And then there's the other person be like, I love the love poems because like this is when I want to feel most vulnerable.
Right, that is such a real point, and I think sometimes we forget that joy and pain don't wait their turns. Sometimes they show up together.
Yeah, exactly. I like to use the example. I don't know if you um, watch Star Wars or are familiar with Star Wars lore, but as a huge Star Wars fan, you have like this concept within the Force called the Grey Jedi, right? And Grey Jedi, they're Jedi, but at the same time, they don't believe they believe that you have to have the light and the dark side of the Force go together. In fact, there's actually a Grey Jedi code that goes, there is no light or dark, there's only the Force. Good cannot exist without evil, but evil must never be allowed to flourish. And so looking at that, the Great Jedi actually were, if you go through like they call it Legends, but for an OG like me, we call it the expanded universe. You know, the reason why Emperor Palpatine was scared of the Great Jedi was it was because of that code. It was because they were truly balanced.
Right, I agree. So, you do a lot of real world organizing work, fighting for community justice, helping people, and speaking up. So, does your poetry come from the exact same place as your activism, or is writing more of an escape for you when you need a break from the fight?
So for me, it's a mix of both. It's a mix of both because yes, like poetry does. You know, I was raised to believe that artists have a duty to talk about what's going on in the community. I was raised like whether you're a painter, you're painting about what's going on, whether you're a poet or a sculptor, you have a duty to use your art to help talk about the world as is and the world you want to see, right? So that's why I was talking. That's why, like we have within hip hop, you have like social conscious hip hop, which talks about that. At the same time, for me at least, is that sometimes I want to write because sometimes I can't bear my feelings out, like verbally, but I can like write it out on paper. Or I can type it on my screen, and I can go, okay, you know something. This is what I'm feeling. Let me just pour it on out. Let me just pour it on all out there. So that's why. So for me, it's a mix of both.
Right. And I love that distinction because I think a lot of people assume that if you are an activist, everything you create has to be a weapon. But sometimes the most radical thing you can do is just feel something and write it down
Mm-hmm.
without an agenda attached to it.
Exactly, and that to me, I think you gotta now like earlier, you gotta have like you gotta use your methods to escape. You know, not every and I tell this to a couple of people that I mentor. You know, not everything you write needs to be a speech or an article. You can just write just for the sake of writing. You can just write just kind of like, you know what, I'm just gonna write it out and that's it. You know, and I'm just gonna leave it there.
Yeah. So the book stops in 2011 to 2018, and we are sitting here in 2026. A lot of time has passed. So when you open this book and read your old poems today, do you still feel connected to them, or does it feel like looking at an old photo album of someone else?
When I read the poems that I wrote and written in blood, I still feel connected to them because of what's going on right now. I hate to say it's kind of like when you listen to Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" album, the stuff he was talking about in 1971 and it's still going on right now in 2026. It's kind of like the same thing. You know, we're still talking about police brutality. We're still dealing with gentrification, or as I like to call it, displacement. Um, and so for me, like the relevancy of now is trying to find the word to say it. Like it's relevant, and it's unfortunate that it's still relevant because you would think we'd be further along, but unfortunately, I think it's crazy because I've been noticing a lot more people have been reading or buying my book written in blood, and I don't know if it's because they're seeing it and they're like, oh my god, this is like from 8 years ago, but it's even more relevant. I think that probably might be the reason why, but it really is like so relevant. And then the looking at an old photo album of someone else. I know I'm old, but I ain't that old.
Right. A lot of these poems were written while you were navigating your 20s, so which is a chaotic time for anyone trying to figure out who they are. Looking back at that 7 year window, what was the biggest lesson life taught you during those years that completely changed how you write?
Ooh, oh yeah, that is definitely a really good question. So just to backtrack, yeah, I was definitely like I started out in my late teens. So 2011 I was 19, and then 2018 I was 26. So like during that time period, I was an undergrad, then I was in grad school, I was working odd jobs while being an activist organizer. Um, and during that time period, just trying to figure out what you want to do, and who you want to do it with. And during that time, like I learned several big life lessons. So I want to try to condense them into like into three big ones. One, in terms of how to change how I write. One, you gotta make time for yourself. You can't, like the saying goes, you can't pour from an empty cup. Sometimes you gotta say, hey, you know what, I need to take some time to be alone, and reflect on what's been happening, what's going on, and you gotta be able to articulate those feelings. The second big life lesson that I would say is that for me during that time period is you gotta have boundaries, right? You gotta be able to have boundaries. Like one of the things that I've learned, I had to learn this the hard way, is you can't be everywhere. Like sometimes you can't overcommit yourself, and you gotta be firm in saying, "Hey, I'm not saying no, but what I am saying is not right now." You know, like maybe if I have some time, or maybe if I take care of my first two prior commitments, maybe if I have time, I can probably then help out. But and then the third big life lesson that I think helped completely change how I write is learning from other people. One of the things that I love doing is I love going to writer workshops because you don't know everything. You don't know everything, and so going to writer workshops and even poetry nights. Sometimes like learning from people who've been in the space for a very long time, you get to figure out, hey, let me pick your brain. Why do you write like that? What benefits has that taught you? How can you teach me how you write or how you how you spit poetry? And I may adapt that to how I write or things I want to write, or I may go, hey, you know what? For this poem, I'll write it like this. But for this poem, I'll just do like my natural like style, which is like a mix of '70s spoken word mixed with golden age. So I mean, but bottom line is like you gotta be humble enough to realize I don't know everything about writing, and these things help. So.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you because even I also feel that from home you can write a very good book with well researched from laptop, but I feel the unfiltered emotion, the rawness that comes only from the real life experience when you observe people, when you meet them, when you learn from their experiences. I really agree with this.
Yes, exactly. You gotta be able to have the experience, like having lived experience. Another thing too, I just thought about is reading. Reading will make you a better writer. Reading
Yes.
because um, I'm big on reading. I know I have my background on, but my room is like my own personal library. I have at least 1,000 books in my room, and I read, and I read constantly. And so, reading will make you a better writer because you get to see structure, you get to see description, you get to see. For me, I feel like you get to see the emotions when you read, and then when you're trying to write, it's like, how can I emote the same feeling when I saw this? You know.
Yeah, I agree. So authors always talk about writer's block, but when you are writing about really heavy real world issues, it can actually get emotionally heavy. So did you ever have those moments between 2011 to 18 where you wanted to put the pen down and stop writing altogether? So how did you push through that?
Well, that's a two-part question. So, yeah, I had moments where I wanted to take some time away and stop writing altogether. Because sometimes when you're, like I said, when you're kind of overflowing, where you kind of like pouring from an empty cup, you face burnout, and when you face burnout, it's like one of two things is going to happen to you. Either your body is going to shut you down, or somebody else is going to shut you down, and and depending on where you're at, it may be bad. And I was fortunate that where I was home with my body and my mind was like, you're going to just rest. And so I used that time. There was a time period I just rested. I kind of caught up with myself. And when I was able to push through that was that I was like, something, now that I've recovered enough, now that I've been able to like catch up on like not just my physical health, but my mental health and my emotional health and my spiritual health, now I can like get back to writing and getting everything organized to really get this published. And it was a process because you're trying to like figure out, do you want to go to publishing companies? And then sometimes you didn't hear back. And then when you did hear back from vanity publishers, I don't know if you've heard about vanity publishing, where you come across a publishing firm and then you got to pay them to publish your book. Which I'm kind of like, why? But then I came across you can self-publish. I said, let me just self-publish. Even if I said, I know I got to do everything myself, but at the end of the day, it's out there. A book's been published, and if I failed, then at least I can fix it. At least I failed on my own terms, but it's out there. So that was the thing that kind of got me pushing. So
Wow. I really like you're so passionate about your writing.
thank you, thank you. No, it's writing, specifically writing poems and stories is what I think helped me get through some very tough times in my life. It was not just an escape; it was healing. Um, Poetry, and for me, it also helped me conquer a stutter that I had that I developed when I was young. And so poetry really helped me conquer that to the point where when I was in elementary school, I had a substitute teacher. Um, she started calling me Kerasostone, which is Greek for golden tongue. So that's when I really started seeing how poetry and art in general is very healing to the soul. In fact, I actually was attending a show. It was a Chinese a Chinese concert. You know, where you have like traditional music from China, from not just mainland China but the Chinese diaspora, and they had some information, and they said like in the Chinese characters, the same character that's used for medicine is the same character that's used for the word music, because they felt like music is like healing.
Right. Even I think that's something readers don't always think about. That the person who wrote the poem about grief actually had to sit inside that grief long enough to shape it into something.
Exactly.
So your background involves a lot of work with community elders in history, like your work with the African Cemetery Coalition. And how much has sitting down and listening to the older generation influenced the way you look at your own life and the stories you wanted to tell?
You know, there's a phrase that we use oftentimes, like we sit on the shoulders of those who came. We sit on the shoulders of those who came before us, and that's so true. You know, the older generation, you know, they went through a lot of things and stayed strong. So then people like, you know, those of my generation can stand on their shoulders. And how this influences my life, or I want to tell, is that I'm looking at generations that are coming behind me, and I want to be able to do a lot of things so that way when my time comes as an elder, you know, the next generation are able to stand on my generation's shoulders. You know, I use this example, like, you know, you have Dr. King and Malcolm X, right? They cleared a lot of fields that like groups like the Panthers, the Republic of New Africa, SNCC, you know, then tried to plant, and they did their job as you know, their generation trying to plant in as many fields as they could. Then you had the generation that came after them that tried to navigate like the new era of the 90s and the 2000s with the war on drugs and the war on terror. And then when my generation was coming up and saw there's still a lot of work that's unfinished, then it's like, now we gotta like pick up and then we gotta fight these battles, not just nationally but local, especially locally, because locally has more of an impact on your life than what happens at the national level. And so I look at this in terms of the stories I want to tell, in terms of like, yes, these are stories, but learn from them, learn from the successes as well as the failures, so that way you have a me. And then I want to be able to look at this, and I was saying this, and now that I'm an uncle again, you know, if you know, when my niece comes of age, I want her generation to have a little bit of an easier time fighting the battles. They'd be like, hey, you know what, my uncle's generation, they did a great job taking care of the heavy lifting, so we just got to come in and just clean up the little messes that are left.
Right. That's a very thoughtful answer you gave.
Thank you, thank you. You know, it was just everything. You know, the thing with the elders is, you may be young today, but you're the elder tomorrow. And I'll say the same thing.
Exactly.
I'm same thing with you. Is I'll say the same thing with you. You know, is that like with what you're doing with your book reviews and interviewing authors and poets, is that there's going to be people that come that are going to be learning from you. There's probably people learning from you right now, and you don't even know it until years later. Like, hey, you know, I got into book reviews because of you, because of Pages of Pandora. I got into interviewing authors because of Pages of Pandora. You know, and then sometimes they may be like, hey, can I collab with you? And they're like, because I'm such a huge fan, but you don't know who you're influencing.
Right. So, last question from my side is, if a young person came up to you today, someone who wants to change their community, loves poetry, but feels totally overwhelmed by how heavy the world is right now. So, what is the main piece of advice you would give them based on everything you have lived through?
So, my main piece, if a young person came up to me today, I would say, like, here are the following main pieces of advice I would say, one is get involved. Find a group that aligns with your values and, like, ask, how can I get involved? You can say, even if it's something mundane as, like, just posting on social media, but use that as an experience as learning. And then, in terms of poetry, Like go to poetry, go to open mic nights. That is very vital. Like especially if you want to like learn and grow and learn things about yourself. Because it's one thing to write poems in your room. It's quite another to then go out and recite them in public. And reciting them in public, you can then learn how to move the crowd. You can then learn from people, like I mentioned earlier, who've been into open mics, spoken word space for a long time. Then third thing I would say in terms of the main piece of advice, learn boundaries, like learn when you're feeling overwhelmed, recognize when you're getting overwhelmed, saying, hey, I need some time. And then the final thing I would say, and I know this is going to sound a bit shocking, but have fun. Seriously, have fun. Like learn to have fun. Like make time for yourself. Like go. One of the things I love doing is that I love movie nights. I love hanging out with my friends. Like we have there's a game night I go to once a month, and we just like either we play either Dungeons and Dragons or we're playing like Mortal Kombat. Learn to have fun because you can't be all work and no play. You gotta learn to have fun. Now, be responsible when you're having fun. I don't do anything super crazy where uh, all of a sudden like you're getting arrested, but have fun. That's why those are my main pieces of advice. My main piece of advice I'll give to anyone who wants to step into activism and poetry.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. You have given very practical advice to everyone out there. And lastly, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. It has been a very thoughtful and intellectual conversation with you. I really loved knowing about your journey. And lastly, to everyone listening out there, do check out the book Written in Blood. It's available on Amazon, and you can also connect with the author on Instagram to stay connected